The 1,000 Sons were the most gifted legion the emperor ever made. A legion where virtually every Astartes carried psychic ability, where 5 cults organized the mastery of different warp disciplines, where a Primarch second only to the emperor himself stood at their head. The lore frames their destruction as hubris. Magnus the Red used forbidden sorcery, shattered the emperor's greatest project, doomed his sons. That reading is incomplete. The flesh change consuming the 15th Legion from within was present before Magnus arrived, before any bargain was struck, before any law was broken. The forbidden sorcery that served as the only cure followed directly from that pressure. The council that turned that cure into a crime came after. The warning Magnus sent in pure loyalty destroyed the emperor's greatest work. Every step reads in isolation like tragedy. Laid in sequence with Tzeentch's canonical behavior as the frame, they read as something else. A chain of engineered positions, each one closing off every exit except the next trapdoor. The 1,000 Sons didn't fall to chaos. They were delivered to it. One distinction needs to be established immediately, because everything that follows depends on it. The flesh change and the Rubric of Ahriman aren't the same event. The flesh change was a pre-heresy degenerative mutation, a gene seed instability specific to the 15th Legion, present before Magnus arrived, that turned 1,000 Sons warriors into mindless abominations. The Rubric of Ahriman was cast decades later, after the heresy, in the Eye of Terror, by Ahriman attempting to halt a second outbreak of that same curse, with consequences that would complete the Legion's binding to Tzeentch's service. 2 separate events on opposite sides of the heresy. The flesh change was the original problem. The rubric was the recursive trap. More on Ahriman's catastrophe when the board reaches that point. The 15th Legion's gene seed was produced on Luna during a brief resurgence of warp storms within the Sol system, a period of psychic turbulence that may have saturated the founding material with immaterium from the start. The initial cohort, termed student aspirants, were drawn specifically from the Achaemenid Empire, a Terran domain that had been under the Emperor's rule for nearly a century, selected for genetic stability and psychic potential together. Azek Ahriman was among them, alongside his twin brother Ormuzd. The Emperor selected these candidates personally. What emerged was unlike any other legion. Within 5 years of beginning the Great Crusade, the 1,000 Sons began spontaneously manifesting psychic abilities across the entire formation, not just in designated librarians, but throughout the rank and file. Games Workshop's official Warhammer community description of the Legion puts it plainly. The 15th Legion, despite being the smallest ever raised, no more than every other Space Marine combined. That is the scale of the prize in everything that followed. Magnus the Red, found on the distant world of Prospero, had already surpassed every psychic master on the planet before the Emperor arrived. The Lexicanum's entry on Magnus, drawing from primary Black Library canon material, describes him as a psyker without peer, save only for the Emperor himself. He had guided Prospero's scholar psyker population, studied every warp discipline available on the planet, and rebuilt the city of Tzeentch, its white marble pyramids and obelisks, its libraries and arcane archives, into a civilization centered entirely on the mastery of psychic knowledge. Magnus organized the 15th Legion around 5 psychic cults. The Corvidae specialized in precognition, probability reading, fate divination, seeing the shape of events before they arrived. They were the Legion's seers. The Pyrae were pyrokinetics, battle sorcerers who conjured and controlled fire in combat. The Raptora commanded telekinesis and kind shields, masters of manipulating the physical world at range. The Athenians were telepaths, able to project into other minds and read the thoughts of enemies across the void. The Pavoni worked biomancy, controlling body chemistry, their own and their opponents, capable of boiling blood and stopping hearts at range. 5 disciplines, practiced across a legion where nearly every warrior carried some psychic ability. Not a military unit, a civilization of warp-capable operators, organized by method of immaterium access. The Corvidae's specific function matters to what follows. Their purpose, looking into the warp and reading the probable shape of things to come, meant they were gazing into exactly the territory Tzeentch inhabits. They spent decades peering into probability and saw nothing to indicate they were already pieces in a design. The Legion's own fate readers, the cult that existed specifically to find what was coming before it arrived, never detected the hand arranging the pieces. That absence is its own kind of evidence. Every 1,000 suns Astartes was, in Tzeentch's operational terms, a door into the immaterium. A whole legion of them, organized by method of warp access, led by the second most powerful psyker in existence. This is what was being acquired. The patience required for the trap stopped seeming excessive when measured against the scale of what was being collected. Tzeentch's canonical titles aren't decoration: Changer of Ways, Lord of Change, Lord of Sorcery, Great Conspirator, and the one that describes his function most precisely, Architect of Fate. His domain encompasses change, mutation, sorcery, ambition, hope, and above all, schemes. He feeds on the desire to become something more, to reach beyond current limits, to act for a cause larger than oneself. Every psyker in the galaxy serves, in some degree, as his preferred instrument. The Chaos Demon's Codex characterizes him as a god who takes great delight in the plotting and politicking of others, making their own plans part of his larger designs. The Book of Tzeentch contains a line that functions as his operational philosophy. I am Tzeentch, and you are the puppet that dances to my tune. It's addressed to no specific subject. The participants don't know they're in the puppet show. His agents don't announce themselves. They arrange the conditions so that the door they want opened appears to be the only door available. The Warhammer fantasy canon records a trait consistent across every iteration of his portrayal. None of Tzeentch's schemes are simple, and indeed often appear contradictory to those few outside observers able to detect the great sorcerer's influence. There is a paradox in Tzeentch's nature that the trap argument requires you to hold in mind. He never completes his plans, not because he fails, but because completion would mean change has ceased, and Tzeentch can't stop changing without ceasing to exist. His schemes are designed to perpetuate themselves, to generate further conflict, further mutation, further chaos. He is canonically a god whose own designs sometimes undermine each other, whose plans within plans produce contradictory outcomes, because the point isn't any single destination. The point is the perpetual motion of the machinery. For the reading that follows, this matters specifically. The trap argument does not require Tzeentch to have had one clean endpoint. His nature doesn't work that way. What it requires is simpler, that he arranged the pressures, placed the only available solutions, and showed Magnus the only doors. Every participant believed they were responding to circumstances. That is the canonical signature of Tzeentchian design, not control, but architecture. The Flesh Change's first recorded outbreak occurred during the compliance of Tzeentch. That timing is the load-bearing fact of everything that follows. The mutation predates Magnus. It predates any bargain, any forbidden sorcery, any violation of imperial law. The 15th Legion was already dying before its Primarch arrived. Graham McNeil's 1,000 Suns provides the definitive account of the mechanism. The flesh change was a gene seed instability, something specific to the 15th Legion's lineage, produced during that warp storm period in the Sol system. Early symptoms were minor: extra growths, additional digits, subtle distortions. Then the progression accelerated. Armor joints split as the body beneath them changed shape. Limbs multiplied or elongated past human proportion. Faces twisted beyond recognition. The terminal stage eliminated everything that defined the warrior, a mindless abomination, functionally a chaos spawn, the soul unreachable beneath the mutation. The Warhammer 40K wiki records that most afflicted legionaries were placed in stasis chambers, in the hope that some future cure could be found, and that the number of active Astartes within the 15th Legion soon began to dwindle to dangerously low levels. By the time the Emperor brought the fleet to Prospero and a Primarch finally stood before his sons, approximately 1,000 active Astartes remained from a formation that should have numbered in the tens of thousands. The Emperor had reportedly considered disbanding the 15th entirely before Magnus was found. The flesh changes mechanism made it uniquely destructive. Other legions carried gene seed quirks. The Blood Angels carry the Red Thirst, the Space Wolves the Canis Helix, but none manifested as uncontrolled chaos spawn level mutation specific to their entire genetic line. The 15th situation was different because the psychic saturation across virtually every legionary created a feedback loop. Using their warp abilities appeared to accelerate the mutation's onset. Not using them left them unable to fight. The Legion was condemned by the very gifts they had been built to carry, before any choice had been made, before any pride had been exercised. Whether Tzeentch originated the flesh change or exploited an existing vulnerability isn't something primary sources confirm in explicit language. Early canon attributes the condition to gene seed instability. Later, Codex-era material describes it using language consistent with a Tzeentchian curse. The Lexicanum records that Magnus would eventually understand he had been Tzeentch's pawn, since the time it had helped him save his legion from the flesh change, and perhaps even long before that. Framing that implies involvement predating the cure rather than originating with it. What the evidence establishes clearly is functional. Whether Tzeentch placed the mutation or positioned himself as the only available cure for one that already existed, the 15th Legion was heading for extinction, and the only exit led through a door Tzeentch was already standing behind. Magnus searched everything available to him. Every data slab the Mechanicum biologist held on psyker mutation, every scroll in Tizca's libraries, every xenobiological treatise the Great Crusade had recovered. He consulted the Emperor directly. He found no conventional solution. The Lexicanum's account of events in 1,000 Suns describes the bargain Magnus eventually struck. He encountered a warp entity identified as Choronzon, the dweller in the abyss, the demon of dispersion, and agreed to terms that cost him his right eye. In exchange, the mutations went into remission. The Legion stabilized and could begin recruiting from Prospero. The flesh change had been halted, the cure worked, and it bound the 1,000 Suns more deeply to warp forces carrying Tzeentchian alignment. The entity Magnus bargained with is described in 1,000 Suns, in terms consistent with Tzeentchian power. The same pattern, a warp entity presenting itself at the moment of maximum desperation, offering exactly what Magnus needed, extracting a price that deepened entanglement, would appear again at the critical moment in the webway. The double bind is precise. Magnus had exhausted every alternative available to a being of his intelligence and resources. The no other choice situation wasn't a failure of imagination. It was the architecture of the trap. The cure, deepening the Legion's warp entanglement, wasn't a side effect. It was the transaction. The next move had already been placed by the time Magnus accepted the terms. That next move came at Nicaea. Around 004.M31, the Emperor convened the Council of Nicaea, a formal tribunal over the use of psychic powers and sorcery within the Legiones Astartes. The Thousand Sons were the specific, named subject. Mortarion had called for their censure for years. Leman Russ had witnessed a flesh-change transformation during a joint action on the world of Shrike and was no longer willing to let the matter rest. Magnus argued with the full force of a Primarch's intellect and persuasion, insisting that no knowledge was in itself forbidden, that limiting his legion was limiting humanity's potential. His own position preserved in the Lexicanum. If I am guilty of anything, it's the simple pursuit of knowledge. The Warhammer 40K fandom article records that, gifted as he was of the intellect and charisma of a Primarch, he refuted each of their points. He lost anyway. The Emperor's ruling, recorded verbatim in A Thousand Sons. Henceforth, it's my will that no legion will maintain a librarius department. All its warriors and instructors must be returned to the battle companies and never again employ any psychic powers. The novel implies the Emperor held the council reluctantly, responding to institutional pressure rather than personal conviction. He made the ruling under genuine political circumstances while unable to see what that ruling would produce. The Edict of Nicaea made the Thousand Sons' survival illegal. Every sorceress working maintaining their gene stability, banned. Every psychic discipline standing between the Legion and the Flesh Change's return, criminalized under penalty of destruction visited by the Emperor himself. The options were obey and await the slow return of the mutation that had nearly eliminated the Legion before Magnus arrived, or continue in secret and become criminals under the laws of the Imperium they had built. The Warhammer 40K fandom article records that Magnus had not ceased the pursuit of the forbidden arts at all, but rather had continued it beyond the sight of his peers, back on Prospero, in secret, under a veil. The Emperor wasn't the villain at Nicaea. He acted in good faith, responding to real institutional concerns about uncontrolled psychic use within the legions. Nothing in his ruling was designed to destroy the Thousand Sons, but the ruling served, precisely, the design of something neither he nor Magnus could detect. The architect of fate does not require his instruments to be malicious. He needs them to behave naturally. The Emperor behaved exactly as a responsible ruler would, and the trap advanced another stage. Prospero, 004.M31. Magnus, on his homeworld, continuing forbidden work behind a psychic veil, receives a vision. Horus's fall, the betrayal taking shape, the galactic civil war already in motion. A Thousand Sons records Magnus attempting to enter Horus's mind during the corrupting ritual on Davin to pull him back, and failing. Having failed to stop the corruption at its source, Magnus turns to warning the Emperor. A warp storm was blocking conventional astropathic communication with Terra. Standard channels were closed. The only method fast enough and penetrating enough to deliver the warning in time was a massive psychic projection. Magnus himself, thrown across the void directly to the Emperor's presence.
This required sorcery. The one thing the Edict of Nicaea had made a capital offense. Multiple senior officers of the Legion argued against it. Magnus overrode them and proceeded anyway, because the alternative was watching Horus destroy the Imperium while Terra remained unwarned. The fandom wiki notes that the only sure way of warning the Emperor was to project his consciousness across the void, and that Magnus believed he had no choice. Crossing the warp toward Terra, Magnus encountered a corridor, a webway passageway running directly beneath the Imperial Palace. He didn't know what project that corridor served. An anonymous voice from within the warp offered him the power to breach the wards protecting it. Magnus, carrying the fate of the Imperium in his urgency, accepted without pausing to identify the source. He tore through the wards. His psychic form erupted into the Emperor's sanctum beneath the Golden Throne. He delivered the warning. The warning landed inside the ruins of the Emperor's greatest work. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The Master of Mankind provides the definitive account of the Imperial Webway Project, a plan to connect all of human space through the ancient Eldar network, rendering warp travel unnecessary. No demonic exposure on every voyage. No dependency on navigators or astropathic communication. The Chaos God's primary avenue of influence over humanity, the unavoidable contact with the immaterium on every journey, eliminated at the structural level. The Emperor had been constructing it in secret beneath the Imperial Palace, occupying the Golden Throne periodically to stabilize the developing human section of the network. The Golden Throne wasn't originally a life support device. It was a webway interface tool, used as an engineer uses a control console. The project, when complete, would have altered the strategic relationship between humanity and chaos more fundamentally than any military victory. Magnus shattered the wards protecting it. The Lexicanum's War Within the Webway article records the consequence without qualification. The Webway portal, deep within the Imperial Palace, became breached. Floods of demons poured through the breach, and the Emperor dispatched the Custodes and Sisters of Silence to hold the line and prevent Terra from being overrun. The Emperor was forced onto the Golden Throne, permanently, not periodically as a tool of construction, but as a full-time psychic seal against the demonic tide pouring through the wound Magnus had torn in his desperation to save him. The device built to open humanity's future became the Emperor's prison in the same moment. The war within the webway ran from 004 to 014 M31. 10 years of fighting. The Legio Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, and Mechanicum forces held a series of blockades through the tunnels beneath Terra against demonic hordes, chaos space marines, corrupted titans, and greater demons. 2 of the 3 commanding Custodes tribunes, Kadai and Jasak, were killed. Ra-Endymion commanded the final stages alone. The ancient Eldar city of Kalistar within the webway eventually fell. The Emperor's project was reduced to a decade-long rearguard action and, ultimately, a permanent seal that imprisoned the most powerful being in the galaxy to maintain it against demonic breach. Magnus did all of this trying to save the Emperor. The Lexicanum's Thousand Suns article records Magnus's eventual understanding. After Prospero, he confronted the reality that a power of the warp had spoken to him, revealing to him that Magnus had been its pawn since the time it had helped him save his legion from the flesh change, and perhaps even long before that. The anonymous voice that helped him breach the Emperor's wards knew what those wards protected. It knew what breaching them would do. It had waited for precisely the moment when Magnus's loyalty, not his pride, not his ambition, but his genuine loyalty, would make him use it.
That is the masterstroke of the trap. Not Magnus's greatest failure, his most loyal act. Arranged to produce the maximum possible damage because the trap required exactly that. The Emperor dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to deal with Magnus. Here the two primary sources diverge in ways that have never been reconciled. 1,000 Suns presents the original order as a retrieval mission. Bring Magnus to Terra, with Horus intercepting Russ en route and arguing, as the Lexicanum records, that to return Magnus to Terra would be a waste of time and effort. Horus confirmed to his traitor council that this intervention would result in Magnus never leaving Prospero alive. Dan Abnett's Prospero Burns presents the same events from the Space Wolves' perspective with different emphases. What Russ was told, and by whom, is less cleanly distinguished. The discrepancy is genuine and deliberately unresolved. What isn't contested? The Emperor's original intent was to bring Magnus in. Horus had clear reasons to want Prospero destroyed, and Russ arrived at Prospero with orders whose exact content the two primary texts can't agree on. Magnus, when he understood what was approaching, dispersed the 1,000 Suns fleet from orbit, shut down Prospero's orbital defenses, and wrapped the world in a psychic veil, preventing communication or the use of powers beyond its boundaries. He had accepted the judgment and was ready to receive it. His legion wasn't. The 1,000 Suns fought for Tzeentch, the City of Light, against the combined assault of Space Wolves, Adeptus Custodes, and Sisters of Silence. 1,000 Suns records the battle's internal collapse in specific detail. Captain Phocis Takar, one of the Legion's senior officers, succumbed to the flesh change in the middle of the fighting and became a chaos spawn. The mutation the sorceress arts had been holding at bay finally breaking through under the pressure of the assault. Captain Fael Turan detonated in a column of uncontrolled etheric power a kilometer across, bringing down the warlord titan Canis Vertex. The Legion was coming apart from the inside even as the Space Wolves pressed in from outside. The flesh change, the same mutation that had defined the entire arc of the 15th Legion's existence, chose the worst possible moment to reassert itself. Magnus joined the battle when the final moment of his legion's extinction arrived, and fought Leman Russ in personal combat. Russ was the stronger. Magnus, defeated, invoked the power that had been speaking to him through the warp since before any of this had formally begun. The same voice that had helped cure the flesh change, that had helped breach the Emperor's wards. Tzeentch answered. A demon world had been prepared in the Eye of Terror. The surviving 1,000 Suns fled through the warp to Sortiarius, the planet of the sorcerers, deep in the Eye. Leman Russ wasn't the architect of the 1,000 Suns' destruction. He executed an order, whose precise content the two primary sources still dispute, within a situation he hadn't created. Horus, already in open rebellion, had every reason to want the 15th Legion destroyed rather than brought intact to Terra. The Space Wolves were a piece on the board, positioned and activated at the moment the trap required them. The Lexicanum, in a passage whose editorial weight is notable, observes of this entire sequence. Considering how Tzeentch had orchestrated events so far, it's likely that they had little choice in the matter at all. On Sortiarius, in the Eye of Terror, the flesh change returned. The 15th Legion had been reduced to approximately 1,000 survivors, the same number as when Magnus first found them on Prospero, the same number the Legion's original name described. Exposed to the raw warp without controls, without the sorcerous disciplines that had been holding the gene seed instability at bay, the mutation reasserted itself.
Ahriman, Azek Ahriman, who had been among the original student aspirants from the Achaemenid Empire, who had risen to chief librarian and first captain of the Legion, assembled a cabal of the surviving sorcerers and designed a ritual to purge the mutations entirely. He drew from the Book of Magnus, the vast tome of sorcerous knowledge the Primarch had compiled across decades of the Great Crusade. This is the Rubric of Ahriman, not the flesh change, and not an event from the heresy period. A separate ritual, cast post-heresy in the Eye of Terror, by a man facing the same impossible choice Magnus had faced with Choronzon: use forbidden sorcery or watch the legion die. The rubric stopped the flesh change. For every 1,000 son who lacked sufficient psychic ability to endure it, it did something else. The Warhammer 40K fandom article records the outcome. The seals and joints of their power armor had been welded shut, and the body within turned to ashes. Rubric Marines, animated suits of ceramite, souls fused to armor, the body within destroyed, independent will extinguished. The majority of the Legion's non-sorcerer warriors became dust-filled automata. They still moved, still carried weapons, still obeyed commands, but the person inside was gone. The Warhammer 40K fandom article records Magnus's response when he saw what Ahriman had done. He turned his back, ascended his tower, and turned his gaze upon the Imperium. In that moment he knew that everything he had ever striven towards was now, quite literally, ashes. He banished Ahriman from Sortiarius. Ahriman has been in exile ever since, pursuing his own attempts to reverse or understand what he caused. Then Tzeentch moved. The Codex, 1,000 Sons, records that he embraced the 1,000 Sons and empowered their remaining sorcerers, granting them new gifts of psychic power and knowledge. The non-psyker majority had been removed by the ritual. The psyker minority remained, enhanced, bound completely to Tzeentch's service. The prize had been distilled to its purest form, doors into the warp, and nothing else. The recursive trap is the final element of the structure. The flesh change that started everything returned after Prospero and forced Ahriman through the same impossible door Magnus had entered decades earlier. Ahriman made the same call. The outcome completed in the Eye of Terror what the burning of Prospero had begun. The 1,000 Sons battle cry is the monument to where the chain ended. All is dust. The hubris reading isn't wrong about the facts. Magnus continued practicing sorcery after Nicaea in full knowledge of the Emperor's ruling. He overrode his officers' objections before the webway projection. His arrogance runs through 1,000 Sons from the first chapter to the last. The accident version of this story, a gifted but proud Primarch who kept choosing knowledge over caution until he ran out of chances, isn't a fabrication. It describes the same events. The question is whether hubris explains the shape of the evidence, or whether hubris was the mechanism Tzeentch used. In the accident reading, the 1,000 Sons fell because of who they were. In the trap reading, they fell because of who they were, and that was precisely why Tzeentch built the trap around them. Their conviction that knowledge could be safely mastered wasn't a flaw that led to corruption. It was the qualifying feature that made them the target. GW has never explicitly confirmed the authored trap reading. The events are canon across Graham McNeil's 1,000 Sons, Dan Abnett's Prospero Burns, Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The Master of Mankind, and the Lexicanum's War Within the Webway article. The interpretation, that each step was arranged rather than merely unfortunate, is a reading, not a GW statement.
It's grounded in the Lexicanum's own editorial framing, which characterizes Tzeentch as having orchestrated events so far, and observes the 1,000 Sons had little choice in the matter at all. It's consistent with Magnus's own eventual recognition, recorded in the Lexicanum, that he had been Tzeentch's pawn since the flesh change cure, and perhaps even long before that. But it's a reading. And here is the quality about that ambiguity that serves the argument rather than weakening it. Tzeentch's plans, by canonical description, are designed to appear contradictory from outside and invisible from within. If you were engineering a trap that needed to look like a chain of free choices, the 1,000 Sons fall is precisely what that trap would look like when examined from the outside.
GW's deliberate ambiguity on the question of Tzeentch's agency isn't a gap in the lore requiring defense. It's the correct design behavior for a god whose schemes are never meant to be traceable. The ambiguity is the architecture. Tzeentch does not play for today. He is the god of 10,000-year moves, the schemer who would rather win in a way no one can trace than win quickly. And the 1,000 suns were the prize worth his longest game, a whole legion of the most gifted psychers the galaxy had ever produced, every one of them a door into the warp, organized by discipline into 5 cults built around different methods of immaterium access, led by a Primarch second only to the Emperor in raw psychic power. Look at the chain one final time. A mutation that could only be cured by the one sorcery that would damn them, a council that turned the cure into a crime, a vision engineered to provoke action, pointing Magnus toward a route to Terra that ran directly through the most critical infrastructure the Emperor had ever built, an anonymous voice in the warp providing the power to breach it. The warning sent in pure loyalty that shattered the Emperor's greatest work and bound him to the Golden Throne forever. A flight into the warp that ended on a demon world prepared and waiting, and then, in the eye of terror, the flesh change returning, forcing Ahriman through the same impossible door, completing the binding that Prospero had begun, leaving the Legion to carry its verdict in 2 words across 10,000 years of service. All is dust. The Corvidae, the 1,000 Suns' own precognitive seers, the cult whose specific purpose was looking into the warp and reading what was coming, never saw any of it. Decades of gazing into probability, and the hand arranging the pieces around them remained invisible throughout. That isn't bad luck. That is the signature of something that was never meant to be found. Every step was a free choice, and every free choice led to the same place, into the palm of the god of schemes. That isn't what an accident looks like. That is what a trap looks like, when the one who set it's patient enough to let you believe you walked in on your own. The 1,000 suns didn't fall, they were delivered. Subscribe for more stories like this.